Well, hey everybody, it's me, the Offerings Fellow. My name is Brian Copeland, and I'm filling in for Teddy Ray today on this, his birthday. So, happy birthday, Teddy. I hope you're getting much deserved rest today. And for everybody else, I don't really have technical ability to make this presentation fancy, so I'm asking for patience. The fact that you are seeing this now, well, that's just a win right there. And I promise that for every bit that I lack in technical ability, I'm just going to make up for with love. All right? So bear with me and let's get to it. If you've been in church only once in your life, chances are that you have been exposed to the parable of the talents. It's very familiar, and that makes it kind of difficult to read and experience in a new way. So I'd like to ask right away that we just press pause on the idea that talents here refer to our individual skills and what makes us unique. Not to say that these things aren't important, but I don't think they're the prime concern here. And if we can, let's just try to imagine how the disciples heard this parable. They're with Jesus, and they're in a place called the Mount of Olives, and it looks out across a valley over to the Temple Mount. And this is only 2 days before the Pharisees and Sadducees hand Jesus over to the Roman authorities to be crucified. And we find Jesus here talking about a lot of stuff. He's talking about end times. He warns that the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And he says a lot of other things too. He talks about coming trials and suffering and how he's going to return in glory. He also teaches his disciples in parables what it means to be servants in the kingdom of heaven and how to be obedient and do the work of the master in the master's absence. And I think we should just go ahead and name right here that Jesus is in no way condoning in this parable what was the institution of slavery. I do think, though, he's acknowledging its existence in the world. And yeah, it's not likely that anyone hearing my voice, my words right now, have any direct experience with slavery whatsoever. Thank God. But let's not be quick to brush these words off here as backwards or embarrassing to our faith. Even worse would be if we adapted the language in our minds as some sort of toxic employer-employee exchange. Because the situation that Jesus is describing, whether this man is just or unjust, whether he intends good or evil, this master has all of the power, and the slaves have none of the power. There are no employee rights posters hanging in the break room because there are no rights. And there's no break room for that matter. But in a situation like this, with the master who is capable of doing what he will eventually do, wouldn't a slave's fear of the master be reasonable? And so I think if you feel some kind of unease in hearing this parable, I think it's completely intended. It gives me feels, if I'm being honest, and my reflexive emotions suggest that the third slave's response was pretty reasonable. His actions could even be seen as responsible, and it's the punishment that seems more unreasonable. I mean, shouldn't we have compassion, and shouldn't we have compassion for those who live in fear? And doesn't God promise to comfort us when we fear? And maybe the poor guy, he just did the best he knew how to do with what he had. And so facing this parable, I have two immediate urges. The first one is a self-audit of my salvation. I ask, am I all set afterlife-wise? Are there any boxes left unchecked? Anything left I need to do? And on the flip side, the other urge is to read these words as simply an exaggeration. Because Jesus, he is way too kind. He is way too loving, just way too cool to do what he's really suggesting here. And so his use of speech, it's for effect. The third option is always less immediate for me. It's to sit with the tension, to ponder its meaning, to pray for enough wisdom to reconcile everything the Bible teaches on love and judgment, on grace and holiness, and how all of this together somehow represents his kingdom. In verse 16, we see the first slave go off at once to work, and we see the second slave go to it in the same way. But in verse 17, the third hesitates, and we're given some understanding why down in verse 24. He surmises his master is harsh because he reaps where he does not sow, and he gathers where he did not scatter. He's in such dread that he can think of nothing better to do than to just, dig a hole in the yard and bury his master's money, because it was nothing more to him than a liability. Instead of risking his master's property, as his cohorts had done, his play was simply not to lose. And so the first red flag here is that the status quo was more desirable to him than following his master's will. And this is a common theme in Matthew. We see it quite a bit in Matthew among those who are, especially those who are called Pharisees and Sadducees, who when encountering Jesus are threatened at the prospect of losing their power and their influence, as if it was theirs to do with as they pleased. And their play was also not to lose. And so they followed the letter of the law above and beyond what anybody else was capable of, all while avoiding the purpose of God's law. And their love for God had become so cold that they actually plotted Jesus' murder in their hearts. But back to the story. Upon the master's return, the third servant confesses. He confesses his fear, and he says, "Take what's yours," as though some great trial had ended. As though a huge transaction had come to a close. And if you've ever had the joy of closing on a house, I'm thinking that kind. As though the only reasonable thing the master should expect, considering all the mental strain he has inflicted on this guy, is just to receive his property as he left it. The servant washed his hands of the master's property, and the master, on the other hand, is having none of it. He calls his servant wicked. And on what grounds does he do this? For scheming? Nope. For lying? Nope. For cowardice? No. And in verse 28, he replies, "You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter?" And then notice how he doesn't deny how the third slave perceives his behaviors, but he does reject the slave's verdict that he's a harsh man. That's interesting to me. But then, in what unfortunately seems to me to be the uber harsh play of the week, he has this slave thrown outside of the gates where there's nothing but misery. So, but does the punishment fit the crime? I think I'd have reason to say no if he was simply on trial for not turning a profit. But Jesus in Matthew repeatedly perceives what is in human hearts. If we hop back to Matthew 12 for a few minutes, down in verse 33, he says, "Either make the tree good and its fruits good, or make the tree bad and its fruits bad, for the tree is known by its fruit." And if you skip down to verse 34, he says, "For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person brings good treasure. The good person brings good things out of the good treasure, and the evil person brings evil things out of an evil treasure. I tell you, on the day of judgment, you will have to give an account for every careless word that you utter. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." And though I don't see any evidence of him breaking God's law, The third servant's words and his actions are the result of his resisting the will of his Lord. His idleness and passivity that we find here arise from a common spiritual condition that we see around us every day, and maybe now more than ever before, but it's always been around. In fact, it's so common that our church tradition has a name for it. Of course, it's a fancy church word, acedia. It means a sluggishness of spirit, resulting in lovelessness and apathy. We commonly call this condition sloth. And our American concept of sloth is pretty much the same as laziness, but in the classical sense that we're talking about here, sloth refers to a spiritual condition in which a person resists the love and transformation of God upon the human heart. So yeah, it's entirely possible to avoid loving God through distraction, Netflix binging, video gaming, intoxication, and so on. But this sense of the word doesn't rule out busyness, so long as it's a means of resisting God's love. You can think of how Ebenezer Scrooge, up until the end of it, resists his own transformation by immersion in his work and turning prophet. He isn't lazy, but he's still overcome with acedia. We've heard Rebecca DeYoung's book, Glittering Vices, quoting from our humble little pulpit down on Regency Road many times. And if you haven't been through this book at least once, I encourage you to consider attending a study on it that Offerings will be having in Lent. In the chapter on sloth, Rebecca DeYoung says this: "The slothful are inwardly unwilling to be moved. They are stuck between a self they cannot bear and a self they cannot bear to become. Their outward behavior, sluggishness, and inertia reflects the state of their heart." The third slave, he says, "Master, I knew you were a harsh man." In the verb tense here, it suggests some sort of finality to his thinking, like he decided once and for all, and he was done with it. But if we're paying attention, as readers, we can see for ourselves his error. If the master was a harsh man, like he said, he wouldn't have supplied all the resources necessary for their success, like it says in verse 15. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. I think of the harshness of Pharaoh when he demanded that the Israelites make bricks without straw. And I think about this man who supplied out of his own treasure the talents for their success. And a harsh man, he won't praise his servants for doing their job. And he certainly doesn't reward them, as he does here when he says, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave." And last, but certainly not least, a harsh man does not invite his servants into his own celebration, as when he says, "Enter into the joy of your master." The third slave's words were careless, and he condemns himself because he doesn't know his master at all. I have a few more thoughts about the master. The first is, whoa, the dude is rich. I found a lot of varying information on how much 1 talent was worth. However, all the sources agree that there was no larger denomination in Greek currency in that time. I found that 1 talent was worth anywhere between 6,000 and 10,000 denarii, meaning if a denarii is worth 1 day's wage, then a talent is worth somewhere around 20 years' wages on the lower end. So to one he gave 100 years' wages, to another 40, and to the third 20 years' wages. And apparently he spread all of this around with enough left over for a long journey. See, these are 2 completely different mindsets happening here, where one servant could not see past the resources in his lap, and the master, meanwhile, is taking risk. He's risking an astounding amount on his servants, all for the growth of his domain, which leads to my second thought. We already discussed how he provided all the resources necessary. The scripture also says he gave each according to their ability, meaning he knew the third servant, and he trusted in him anyway, and in return what he received for his provision was blame. when the other two demonstrated their faithfulness, they are rewarded, which leads to my third thought about the master. And if just bear with me, because this came after very careful analysis of the text in verses 21 and 23. And I know we're getting a little late in the sermon, but I invite you to listen closely and see if you can spot the differences. In verse 21, he says, his master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Okay, got that? Now listen to verse 23 and compare. It says, his master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Did you get it? Did you spot the difference? You can back up and replay this as many times as you like. I can wait. Or you can just hear this. There is no difference. It's the same response for both of them. It's verbatim. Now each were invested according to their ability, but both received equal reward. They were entrusted with greater authority in their master's estate, and they were then invited into their master's joy. That's all grace. And this word joy, charis, if you want to geek out on it a bit, it happens only a handful of times in the book of Matthew, and it's always in the presence of God or in the good news of his favor. The next and final time we encounter charis is with the two Marys when they go to the tomb and they receive the good news of the resurrection of Jesus. Matthew 28:8 says, "They left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples." And so my last thought on the master here is brief. That the master didn't leave specific instructions on what to do with his property, but he left an example by taking on a good bit of risk and investing in others. The master here has demonstrated abundance, that he's full of authority and grace, and that he rewards faithfulness. And in the teacher of this parable, Jesus, we find the heart of a servant. And when you hold tightly to knowing who the teacher is, you have a vital part of the wisdom necessary to understand this parable. The opening verses of Proverbs claims that fear is the beginning of wisdom. And the Bible is very consistent about what happens to people, their experience when they come into contact with God's glory. They're afraid. And whether it's God's voice or his angel, God consistently assures them, saying, "Fear not," because fear is the natural human response when one comes into contact with God's glory. And so fear may be the beginning of wisdom, but that doesn't mean it's equal to wisdom. I'm going to go ahead and offer that the other part of wisdom is that which gave the two Marys such joy when they heard the good news of the resurrection. You know why they were so happy, why they received the news with both fear and great joy, because they love Jesus. And so when I think about that great fear and great joy, and I think about this master and how he praises and he welcomes the first and second servants, it's because they are known and they're loved by him, while the third refused to move forward in faith of who the master is. And so if this parable makes you uneasy, I think it's okay. I think it's by design. But to be scared into a self-audit of our salvation is to in some way experience the master as the third slave does. Likewise, to write off the consequences of the third servant as rhetoric is another mistake. This series of parables all end with someone being banished into misery and despair. Its repetition is only for emphasis, for a very important reason. And to dismiss that reason is to ignore a crucial part of who Jesus is claiming to be. Part of love, it's placing a higher value on another's joy than your own. And this is the love that Jesus embodies. And this is the kind of love that encourages those who love him to endure while the love of others runs cold. The third servant chose poorly. He bet on himself. Meanwhile, the other two were betting on the part that he never knew, the goodness of their master. If fear is the beginning of understanding this parable, I think love is the other. In acedia, it chokes love before love can take root. Because when we willfully hold back our love for God, sloth also blocks us from receiving God's love for us. Many faithful who have gone on before us, who we follow in our church today, have found that acedia lies opposed to the Christian virtue called diligence. And if you want to geek out on that word a bit, it shares its root in the Latin word for to hold in high regard or to love. In his love for us, God demands no love from us. Yet God desires our love, which is given through submissive hearts. And so the good news is that no amount of effort is necessary to earn God's love. But the challenge is that effort is necessary to love God back. God's love saves us, and our love serves him. And Jesus promises that the burden of our work will be light. But he also knows that obedience does not come easy to the human heart, and it's not a one-time decision. I understand that I'll probably end up sticking my foot in my mouth before this is over. But I think where we've gone off track in teaching and learning this parable in the past is when we liken these talents to human characteristics. There's a lot of interest in the church right now in finding strengths and types and qualities that God has for some reason hidden deep in our being that must be discovered in order to find our way and to be fulfilled. Sure, there's absolutely good in wanting to give God our best, but God's call to us is to obedience, and it's not for his good, but for ours. God uses our obedience in part so that he can remake our hearts to be like the heart of Jesus. Anything after that is secondary. And we see that while the master invests different amounts in different people, he rewards them equally. And knowing this, it's an honor to be counted the second servant. And here's the part where I step on my own toes, when I consider how many times the second has not been good enough for me. How many times I've desired what God has invested in another. And maybe if I can discern a few more strengths or qualities deep within myself, I can find more fulfillment in myself rather than in God. I think this parable is in some part teaching that the work of a disciple is less about what we do and how much we do, but more about why we do it. Jesus says the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. I think these words best summarize our parable today, and they speak clearly to us in this day maybe more than a couple years ago, as we have less physical contact with one another, and we have more contact with their thoughts and feelings on social media and in the news and in God Help Us, the comment sections. If we spend time there, it's easy to see a tidal wave of bitterness and anxiety and despair crashing through the culture. And it's easier more than ever to retreat behind our walls and avoid our own anxieties through diversion and dependencies. So friends, I encourage you to hold fast. Stay diligent in those practices which bring you into regular contact with God. The temptation to check out mentally, emotionally, spiritually is great. So hold fast, because we're not betting on ourselves. We're betting on Jesus. Remain diligent and enter into the joy of your Master. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.